Well, hello and welcome back to the Biography Channel. Now, in this series, I've previously covered the lives of Abraham and Isaac, and today we're going to look at the life of the last patriarch in that great trio of patriarchs who are often grouped together. That's Jacob, whose name is later changed to Israel. Now, Jacob of Israel was the father of the 12 sons, whose descendants would become the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation that God would choose to work with in particular for the rest of the Old Testament period. Now, Jacob's story is told to us in the second half of the book of Genesis. Now, the birth of his and his paternal twin brother Esau is told to us in Genesis 25, and his death and burial are covered in Genesis 49 and 50. Now, Jacob was the third link in the chain of God's plan to start a nation from Abraham. Now, he was born, according to my tentative chronology, in the year 1790 BC. Now, he would move to Haran and marry his two wives, Leah and Rachel. He would live in Haran for 20 years, begetting 11 of his 12 sons and a daughter in that time before moving back to Canaan. Now, following the extraordinary events of Joseph's wives, where he eventually became Egypt's vizier under the Pharaoh, Jacob moved his family to Egypt in 1660 BC, when he was 130 years old. Now, he would then go on to live in Egypt for another 17 years before he died at the ripe old age of 147. Now, in part one of this message, we're going to examine the first two major phases of his life up to the time that he returns to Canaan and reunites with his brother Esau. Now, we'll cover his second sojourn in Canaan and his time in Egypt in part two.
In the first part of this look into the life of Jacob, we'll examine his life up to the time he leaves for Canaan to find a wife, following the deception that he pulled on his father. In part two, we'll examine his life in Haran up to when he returns to Canaan and reunites with his brother Esau. And finally, in part three, I will cover his second sojourn in Canaan and his time in Egypt.
Now, I've given you all two handouts. One is on Jacob with a timeline, maps, and the lessons that we're going to draw out from his life. Now, the second handout is on the tribes of Israel.
We'll look at some of the material in that handout in part three.
Now, here is a diagram showing the patriarchal family tree. Now, Jacob's grandparents on his father's side were obviously Abraham and Sarah. And on his mother's side, his grandparents were Bethuel and Milcah, who lived in Haran. Now, Jacob's parents were Isaac and Rebekah. And Rebekah's brother was Jacob's uncle Laban, who was the father of Jacob's two wives, Rachel and Leah, who with their two handmaids would become surrogate mothers and bore Jacob's 12 sons and a daughter named Dinah. Now, before we look into the life of Jacob, let's review God's greater plan in working with the patriarchs. Now, in our United Church of God booklet of the United States and Group in Bible Prophecy, we read, God then set in motion a major aspect of his plan to offer salvation to mankind. Selecting Abraham was crucial in God's long-term plan to turn all nations back to him. The remainder of the Bible is woven around his plan to reconcile all humanity to himself. Now, God chose Abraham and promised to develop his descendants into a group of influential nations chosen for the purpose of teaching and illustrating his values and way of life to the rest of the world. End of quote. Now, God wanted his people to be a light upon a hill to draw and attract the Gentiles to him. Now, we'll look more into the purpose of why God raised up the nation of Israel a little later and see how the physical nation of Israel fits in with God's plan to also build a spiritual nation through those who call out in the New Testament church. Now, Jacob's father Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Now, a few verses later, after Jacob and Esau were born, it notes in Genesis 25-26 that they were born 20 years later when Isaac is 60 years old. Going back to verse 21, we read, Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Now there was almost 20 years when she did not have children before God intervened and she became pregnant. It was a tough pregnancy, and she sought God's answers as to why. Now in verse 23 we read, And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are born in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. One shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in the womb. And the first came out red, and he was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau. Now Esau means hairy, and his alternate name, Edom, means bread. Now he got that alternate name for Edom, meaning bread, from the bowl of red stew that he traded his birthright for. Now it says here that Esau came out red. Now that may or may not mean that he was a redhead. I mean, red may refer to the initial tone of his skin at birth, which may become a pink or lighter skin as he grew up. Now then goes on to say in verse 25, Afterward his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Now Jacob, or Yaakov in Hebrew, means heel catcher. And we'll see later in his story how fitting it was, as it can also mean someone who trips up another.
Before the story of Jacob and Esau's birth in Genesis 25, Abraham died after Jacob and Esau were born. Now Abraham died at the ripe old age of 175. Now his son Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. Now Isaac was therefore 75 years old at the time that Abraham died. Now as we just saw, Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob and Esau were born. Now since Abraham dies when Isaac is 75 years old, that means that Jacob and Esau are 15 years old at the time that their grandfather Abraham dies. Now Abraham was buried in the same tomb that he purchased for his wife Sarah in Hebron in the cave of Machpelah, which means a double cave. Now in Genesis 25 we read in verse 27, So the boys grew, and Esau was a skilled hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. Now Esau was the outdoors type, while Jacob was generally the indoors scholarly type, though we'll later see that he's well skilled in animal husbandry and business when he is in Haran. Now verse 28 says, And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So we see here the seeds of a problem that will climax with the reception regarding who is blessed to become the next patriarch of the household after Isaac dies. We see here each parent having a favourite child. Isaac favours Esau, while Rebekah favours Jacob. Now before the deception over the blessing comes, there's an earlier incident revolving around the birthright or double portion of the inheritance of Isaac after his death. Now prophetically, when we talk about the birthright, we often think of the blessings of national greatness. Now Jacob and Esau are not thinking that long term here. The birthright to them is the double portion of their inheritance from their father Isaac after he dies. Now in Genesis 25, starting from verse 29, we read the following. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, Sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, Look, I'm about to die, so what is this birthright to me? Then Jacob said, Swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now Esau was more concerned with his immediate need of food and put little value on his father's inheritance, which he would not see for years. Jacob valued it much more. Now no doubt his mother told him about the prophecy that God had shared with her, that Jacob the younger would rule over Esau the older of the paternal twins who came out first. But that said, this was no guarantee of the birthright inheritance. So he took advantage of the time of weakness for Esau when he was very hungry to bargain for the birthright. Now in Jacob's defence, he offered to buy it from Esau. He did steal it from him, and Esau willingly promised it to him for a bowl of red stew with lentils. Now when I spoke on lessons from Abraham, I discussed the reasons to conclude that the family business of the patriarchs was not primarily raising cattle and sheep, which were only a small part of it. Now Abraham moved between 4 key locations on the ridge route that ran down the central highlands from north to south. Now he would move between Shechem, Bethel, Hebron and Beersheba. Now all 4 of the cities Abraham frequented are on the ridge route where there are crossroads, shown here in green, between the Via Maris and the King's Highway. Now apart from meeting Melchizedek and the sacrifice of Isaac, neither Abraham nor Isaac or Jacob spent any time with their business, it seems, in Jerusalem. Now while Jerusalem is on the ridge route, it is not on one of those crossroads between the major highways. Now Isaac, who is now the patriarch of the family after Abraham's death, appears to just concentrate his business in the south between Hebron and Beersheba. Now when Jacob returns from Haran with his wives and sons, he will operate solely from his father's household as a patriarch of his own. Now coming back to Jacob's early years, we find that when a famine hits, Isaac takes Rebekah, Jacob and Esau and the rest of their business entourage to Gerar, which is on the crossroad that goes from Beersheba to Gaza on the coast. Now when I covered lessons from Isaac, we looked at the rocky relationship that Isaac had with the Philistines and how he eventually moved back up to Beersheba. Now the next event that occurs in Isaac's life is when he is old and his eyesight is virtually gone, when he wishes to give Esau the blessing, which meant that Esau would be the patriarch of the family when Isaac dies. Now God had told Rebekah when Jacob and Esau were born that the older son would be under the younger son. Now God had told her that the second born was to receive the blessing of patriarchal authority. Now Isaac, now in his old age, decided to change this and give the blessing to their eldest son, Esau. Now Isaac, who was now virtually blind, asked Esau to hunt for him and bring him some savoury game food, and then Isaac would bless him. Now Rebekah overheard his plan and arranged it so Jacob tricked Isaac into thinking he was his brother. Now Esau was a hairy man, and Jacob knew that Isaac would feel the difference in their skin and know that it was Jacob. So Rebekah put goat skins on his arms and neck and prepared some savoury food for Jacob to take to Isaac. Now Isaac thought his skin felt like Esau, but the voice sounded like Jacob. Now despite his doubts, Isaac goes ahead and gives Jacob the blessing of patriarchal rule, thinking he was giving it to Esau. Now Esau soon after then brought savoury food to his father. And we read the verses from verse 31. Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that your soul may bless me. And his father Isaac said to him, Who are you? So he said, I am your son, your firstborn, Esau. Then Isaac trembled exceedingly and said, Who? Where is the one who hunted game and brought it to me? I ate all of it before you came, and I have blessed him, and indeed he shall be blessed. And when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, Bless me, me also, O my father. But he said, Your brother came with deceit and has taken away your blessing.
Now in Genesis 27 verse 36 we read of Esau's reaction when he finds out what has happened. He says, "For he," talking about Jacob, "has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." Now Esau says, "Is he not rightly called Jacob?" Now as we've seen, Jacob means heel catcher, which can mean supplanter, or one who trips up someone else. Now we also see here a clear distinction between a birthright and a blessing. What's the difference between the two? Now on the Lula Vista Church of Christ website, they give a very good explanation of the difference between the birthright and the blessing in the story of Esau and Jacob. They write, "A birthright referred to a person's inheritance. For most of the world's history, the firstborn child of a family would receive an extra inheritance from his father. The double portion came as a right of birth, that is, the right of being firstborn. This is what Esau sold to Jacob for a bowl of red bean stew when he returned hungry from a hunting trip. The family blessing was a way to designate who became the head of the extended family when the father died. Now, like the birthright, the blessing generally went to the eldest son, but not always. A change in the blessing also happened in Isaac's family. Before Isaac's twin sons were born, God said, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." Jacob tricked Isaac into thinking he was his brother. Thus, Isaac gave the blessing to his second son, just as God had said, even when he tried to go against God. End of quote. Now in verses 39 and 40, Isaac gave a prophecy about Esau. Now verse 39 is translated the opposite way in the King James and the New King James Version compared to certain other versions. Now those other versions have the more correct translation, and I've added words in here to give the correct intent of the prophecy. It says, "Then Isaac his father answered and said to him, Behold, your dwelling shall be away from the fatness of the earth, and away from the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass, when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck." Now Esau's descendants lived to the southeast of the Dead Sea near Petra and Mount Seir, which are dry, less fertile areas than the land of Israel. Now Esau's descendants were warlike, and often the people of Edom were under tribute to Israel. Now that prophecy about breaking out from under Israel's control came to pass in the days of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, when they successfully rebelled from being Israel's tributary. Now after Jacob's deception, it says in verse 41, "So Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, The days of mourning for my father at hand, then I will kill my brother Jacob." Now Esau is determined to kill Jacob after their father dies. Now as it turns out, Isaac would live another 43 years, a lot longer than Esau probably thought he'd have to wait. Now Rebekah and Jacob should have learned from the lesson of Abraham and Sarah regarding God's promise to give them a son. Now Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hand with Hagar rather than patiently wait on God. Now their compromise led to much inferior results. Now Rebekah knew of God's promise to give the blessing to Jacob, and under the pressure of Isaac intending to give it to Esau, she panicked and took matters into her own hands. And rather than trust God to make his promise come about in a just and moral way, she resorted to pressuring Jacob to lie and deceive Isaac. Now the resulting hostility from Esau, and then Jacob being on the other end of being deceived later by Laban, were the inferior consequences of breaking God's law to have what God had promised earlier. Now under pressure, we can likewise give in to fear and take matters into our own hands, no longer trusting God. Under pressure, we can stop doing things God's way and break his law to have what we yearn for. Now, the first lesson that we can learn from Jacob's life is don't take matters into your own hand and break God's law to have what you want or what God promises. The ends do not justify the means. Now, Rebekah is now very concerned for Jacob after hearing about Esau's desire to kill him, and arranges to have Jacob sent away for a time until Esau's wrath passes. Now in Genesis 27 and 28 we then read, "And Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth, like these, who are the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me?" Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." So Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram. Now Isaac sends Jacob off to Haran, and even tells him who to marry, one of his uncle Laban's daughters, who he's never seen before. Now Esau heard about what Isaac said to Jacob about not taking a wife from the Canaanites, and knew that his wives displeased Isaac. So he then took another wife, a daughter of his uncle Ishmael. Now we have to do a bit of digging to look for clues to figure out just how old Jacob was when he left for Haran and soon after married Leah and Rachel. We have to work backwards from when Jacob moves to Egypt to gather all the chronological data that we need. Now, first of all, we're told in Genesis 47 verse 9 that Jacob was 130 years old when he moves to Egypt and meets the Pharaoh. Now in Genesis 41 and 46, we're told that Joseph was 30 years old when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream and was made vizier over Egypt. Now we're also told in Genesis 45:6 that when Joseph asked his brothers to bring Jacob to Egypt, that 2 of the 7 years of famine had passed. Now prior to that, we know from Joseph's interpretation of the dream that there were 7 years of plenty that preceded that. So if Joseph was 30 years old at the beginning of the 7 years of plenty, and we add 2 years of famine, we know that Joseph was 39 years old when his father moved to Egypt. So now if we subtract from Jacob's age of 130 when he moved to Egypt, Joseph's age of 39 at the time, we see that Jacob was 91 years old when he gave birth to, when he had Joseph. Now Genesis 31:41 tells us that Jacob was 20 years in Haran, which comprised the 14 years that he worked for his 2 wives, and another 6 years for the flocks that he acquired. Now Genesis 30:25 tells us that just after Joseph was born, that Jacob asked formal permission to leave. Now Laban convinces him to stay on longer, offering him flocks in return, which we saw before he worked 6 years for. Now this very strongly implies that Joseph was born at the end of his 14 years of dowry service when he starts his extra 6 years. Now we saw before that Jacob was 91 years old when Joseph was born. So Joseph appears to have been born 14 years after Jacob left for Haran. So if we now subtract those 14 years from 91, we come to the extraordinary conclusion that Jacob was single and a surprisingly old age of 77 years old when he left for Haran and got married. Now within 20 years, he'll go from being single at age 77 to having 2 wives, 2 concubines, and giving birth to an entire football team. I guess there's hope in there for some of us older bachelors. Now we saw previously when I spoke about Abraham and Isaac that there was a large entourage that accompanied the patriarchs, such as the 300 plus servants born in Abraham's household that went with Abraham to rescue Lot. Now, most of these would have originally come from the patriarch's original homeland in and around Haran. Now, Abraham's chief servant, Eliezer, is noted as being from Damascus. Now, amongst all of Isaac's servants, there presumably would have been a number of attractive women that Jacob could have potentially married, yet he is still single at 77 years old. And remember too that Isaac was 40 years old when Abraham sent his servant away to find a wife for him. Now, it's highly likely that Isaac and Jacob not marrying from any of their female servants of their entourage may have to do with what was culturally acceptable at the time. They would have considered themselves a noble family and desired their children to marry those of another noble family. It kind of seems that the servants were off limits when it came to marriage, with them preferring to marry within their own extended noble family back in Haran, rather than anything available to single women of their business entourage. Now, since Jacob was 77 when he left for Haran in Paddan Aram, this means that Isaac was 137 years old when Jacob tricks Isaac into giving him a blessing. Now, Isaac would then be 157 years old upon his return. Now we come to a pivotal moment in Jacob's life, what would be a spiritual turning point. Now, Jacob travels from Beersheba on his way up to Haran. Now, along the way, he stops at a place that up to this point in time is called Luz, but will receive a new name from Jacob after a vision that he has in his sleep. Now, he dreams about seeing a stairway to heaven, not to be confused with the Led Zeppelin song, which has nothing to do with it. Now, Jacob sees angels going up and down, and the Lord standing above it. Now, God then speaks to him and says, "I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. And your seed shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. And in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you." Now, just as he did with Abraham, God promises to make his descendants as the dust of the earth and give him the land of Canaan. Now, he promises that they will spread abroad, implying spreading further beyond the land of Canaan in all directions, and his seed shall be a blessing to all the nations of the world. And God then promises to protect him and bring him alive back to the land of Canaan. Now, just as an aside, note the cardinal directions mentioned in verse 14, where Jacob's seed would spread abroad to: west, east, north, and south. Now, we'll look further into where the descendants of Jacob migrate to in part 2, but it's interesting to note how those cardinal directions match the chronological expansion of the British Empire: west to America and the Caribbean, east to India, then north to Canada, and then south to Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. This is none other than the house of God." And he called the name of that place Bethel, and Bethel means house of God. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I'm going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I've set up as a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give to me, I will surely give 1/10 to you." Now, notice in Jacob's vow the word "if." He says, "If God will be with me and bring me back, then the Lord will be my God, and I will give 1/10 or tithe to him." He makes this conditional vow. Now, it's not ideal, but it's a good starting point in the right direction. He then anoints the stone he uses a pillow with oil. Now legend has it that this stone was in the possession of Jeremiah, and he took it with one of Zedekiah's daughters to Ireland, that this stone became a stone of scone that was fitted into the coronation chair that all the British monarchs had been coronated upon. Now there's no way to prove that legend, but it does make me wonder if it was retrieved from Bethel later by Jacob or someone else, and if any of the kings of Israel were perhaps coronated on it. So Jacob continues on his journey on to Haran. Now Albert Barnes in his commentary notes the distance is 450 miles or 600 kilometres, which is a little less than the distance between Brisbane and Newcastle. Now Barnes notes that if he walked 30 miles or 50 kilometres a day, he would have covered the distance in about 15 days.
So on that note, we'll break there and continue the story of Jacob in Haran next time in part 2 of Lessons from Jacob. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Bible Biography channel and part 2 of Lessons from Jacob. Now in part 1 we examined the story of Jacob up to the time he left for Canaan to find a wife following the deception that he pulled on his father. Now we discovered that he was a surprisingly old age of 77 at the time when Isaac sends him away to Haran to find a wife amongst his kinfolk there. Now along the way Jacob has a vision of a stairway to heaven at Bethel where God promises to protect him and bring him back to Canaan. Now from Bethel, Jacob then continued on to Haran.
Now Albert Barnes in his commentary notes the distance is 450 miles or 600 kilometres, which is a little less than the distance between Brisbane and Newcastle. Now Barnes notes that if he walked 30 miles or 50 kilometres a day, he would have covered the distance in about 15 days. Now when he arrives, he asks the men if they know Laban, and then we read starting in Genesis 29 verse 9, while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. So she ran and told her father. Now I'm sure that Jacob would have been very happy and very relieved at just how attractive Rachel was to him. And then it came to pass, when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. So he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him for a month. Now Laban is very excited to meet his nephew Jacob, and veiled in his expression, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh," is a hint of a plan that Laban has in his mind we'll look at shortly. Now Jacob stays with them a month before the subject of a marriage contract is thrashed out. Now in that time we'll see it a few verses later how he grew to love Rachel. Now verse 1 then goes on to say of Genesis 29, then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Now Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." And Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love that he had for her. So we see here that Laban has 2 daughters, Leah, the oldest, and Rachel, the younger. Now Leah's name means wearied. Now there's nothing in the text to explain why she was given a name with such an unflattering meaning. Now Rachel's name means you. Now given the name Rachel ends with EL, I was a little bit surprised that the name of God isn't somewhere in that particular meaning. Now we've already seen how attractive to men Sarah and Rebecca were in my previous messages. Now Rebecca appropriately means captivating. Now this trend of great physical beauty continues in the next generation of female patriarchs, with Rachel, who is described as beautiful of form and appearance. Now the Hebrew word toah here means outline or figure. Now in modern vernacular we would say that she had a great body. Now Leah, on the other hand, is said to have delicate eyes. Now commentators are divided on whether this was a compliment or a gentle way of saying that she wasn't quite so attractive. Now maybe she did have beautiful eyes, or perhaps she was cross-eyed. There's no real way to be sure of it. Now either way, it was Rachel who stood out to Jacob, and the one that he loves and wants to have as his wife. Now when Laban proposes what his wages for working for him should be, Jacob offers to work to him for 7 years to have Rachel to be his wife. Now this 7 years of service would be the dowry that he'd have to pay for his wife. Now that raises a very interesting question. Now we know that the patriarchal family is very wealthy. Why doesn't Jacob have anything of any monetary value to give as his dowry? Now when Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac, we read in Genesis 24:53 that the servant brought out jewelry of silver, jewelry of gold and clothing, and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave precious things to her brother and to her mother. Now those items were seen to have acted as dowry for Rebekah. Now when Isaac sends Jacob back specifically to get a wife, he seems to provide no dowry for him to take. Now there's a bit of a mystery on which the scripture is silent about. Now perhaps he did have a dowry when he was on his way up to Haran, or perhaps, more likely, did Isaac deliberately send him without one as punishment for the deception that he'd done on him previously. Now verse 20 says that Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they only seemed a few days because of the love that he had for her. Now that sounds wonderfully romantic, doesn't it? Well, I can assure you that if you had to wait till the end of the 7 years before we could actually marry her, it would have felt not like a few days, but like 70 years. Now let's look at the story of Jacob's weddings now to back that point up of when his marriages were consummated. Now starting from verse 21 of Genesis 29, we read, Then Jacob said to Laban, Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, so that I may go into her. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. Now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to be to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. Now notice that Jacob says to Laban, For my days are fulfilled. He doesn't say my years are fulfilled. Now some have mistakenly thought that he doesn't marry his 2 wives until he served his first 7 years. Now we'll see later that Joseph is born at the end of the 14 years of dowry service. Now if Jacob had to wait 7 years before he married either of the 2, that means he would have had 12 children in 7 years. Now Leah herself bears 6 children by the time that Joseph is born, and has a period of not bearing after her 4th son, so it is highly improbable that his first child isn't born until the second of 7 years. Now the days imply a certain number of days from a written contract before he could take Rachel as his wife. Now the initial month that Jacob stayed with Laban may have been part of that contract period. So they hold a great wedding feast. Laban, perhaps sensing a way to marry off both his daughters and get more service out of Jacob, pulls a deception not unlike the one that Jacob had previously done with his father Isaac. Now Laban, probably under cover of a veil and darkness and much alcohol, presents Leah for Jacob to have as his wife. Now Jacob doesn't pick up on the deception and unwittingly consummates the marriage with Leah and not Rachel, who he thought he was marrying. Now he doesn't discover the deception until the morning. I mean, there's only one question that comes to mind whenever I read this, and that is just how drunk was Jacob? Now Rachel and Leah may have protested about what Laban was doing, but obedience to one's elders was much more entrenched as a custom at this time, and so they obeyed Laban without alerting Jacob. Now Jacob then confronts Laban and says, "What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me?" And Laban says, "It must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and we will give you this one also for the service with which your servant is still another 7 years." Then Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. So he gave him his daughter Rachel as wife also. And Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid. Then Jacob also went into Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served with Laban another 6 years. Now Jacob is obviously angry with the deception, but he can't undo the situation. He has consummated the marriage with Leah and realises Laban may be right about the custom of marrying the firstborn before the second. Now Laban then offers him marriage to Rachel at the end of the week, long marriage feast for Leah, if he will give him another 7 years of service. Now realising he can only have Rachel if he comes to terms with Laban, he agrees to what he would have thought was a rather dodgy deal. Now it says that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. Now Jacob didn't seek Leah, so naturally he's going to love Rachel more. However, this favouritism towards one particular wife and later the children of that particular wife, but compared to the others, is going to later come back and haunt him. Now when I spoke about Abraham and Isaac, we saw that Sarah bore Abraham no children before the miraculous birth of Isaac. Isaac's wife Rebecca was also barren until God healed her. Now Jacob has now married his 2 cousins, Leah and Rachel. Now Genesis 29:31 says, "And when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." Now Rachel was barren, and the implication here is that Leah may have been barren also, since God actively opened her womb, seeing she is the less favoured wife. Now infertility is known to be a symptom of incestuous relationships. Now this issue of infertility amongst the patriarchs may have been a potential consequence of marrying such close relationships. Now Sarah was Abraham's half-sister, Rebecca was the daughter of Isaac's cousin, and Rachel and Leah were both cousins to Jacob. Now marriage between such close relations as these, you'll see, is later prohibited by God in the statutes that he gave to Moses. Now this infertility problem with the patriarchal women worked well in God's plan with the patriarchs. Now the 12 tribes that descended from Jacob, who was later called Israel, were a miracle. Not just once, but 3 times over. And God had to miraculously intervene with 3 generations of mothers for each of them to be born. Now this triply emphasised that God's election comes by God's grace and miraculous intervention, and not by our own merit. Now Genesis 29 and 30 give an account of the birth of all the children except for Benjamin, who was born after Jacob returns to Canaan. Now what is quite remarkable in these chapters is that the meanings of all the names of the sons born to Jacob are mentioned. Now God inspired them to be recorded, as those name meanings will play a part in God's unfolding plan for Israel. Now in the Bible, many things are multi-layered, like the layers of an onion. The meaning given to each of the sons of Jacob are that way as well. Now at one level, they tell the story of 2 women competing for favour with their husband in what could be called a baby race. At another level, we will see that when the meanings of those names are strung together, they tell the story about Jacob and the people of God. So let's look at the story of the birth of Jacob's children. Now Leah is unloved, so God opens her womb and she bore a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, "The Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my son will love me." Now Leah is desperately hoping that having a son will lead to Jacob loving her in the same way that he loves Rachel. Now Reuben means behold or see a son. Now she has another son and calls his name Simeon or Shimon, which means hear, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved and given me this son also. Now Leah then has a third son, and this ache to have her husband love her the same way that Jacob loves her sister Rachel is painfully evident. She calls him Levi, meaning joined, as she says, "Now this time my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons." Now by the time that son number 4 comes along, she realises that this isn't working. Jacob still doesn't favour her the way that she's desperately hoping he will. There is, at least temporarily, a sense of resignation that Jacob won't give her the love that she craves. She now looks to the Lord for that love and deeper relationship that she craves, instead of trying to find that with Jacob. She calls him Judah, which means praise. And she says, "Now I will praise the Lord." Now Jacob's first 4 sons are all from Leah. Now we will see later that the blessing or the right to rule as the next patriarch will bypass Reuben because he has sexual relations with the concubine who bears the next son of Jacob. And we will also bypass Simeon and Levi because of their terrible violence they do to the people of Shechem. Now the 4th born son, Judah, will eventually receive the blessing or the right to rule as patriarch. The scepter promise of kingship will rest with Judah, starting with King David. Now the next 4 sons are those born to the handmaids who act as surrogate mothers for Rachel and Leah. Now Rachel is still barren, and she is simply beside herself, as barrenness is a great stigma to women in this particular age. And she says to Jacob, "Here is my maid Bilhah, go into her and she will bear a child on my knees, that I may also have children by her." Then she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged my case, he has heard my voice, and given me a son. Therefore he shall be called Dan." Now notice that she says that I also may have children by her. Now legally the child would be Rachel's, not that of the concubine. Now Rachel says that God has given me a son. Now his name is Dan, meaning judge, as she feels God has judged her case and given her the son that she has so long craved for. Now the jealousy between the 2 sisters is painfully evident after Bilhah bears her another son, and Rachel says, "With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister." Now Naphtali means wrestling. Now by this stage Leah has now gone quite some time without bearing, and not to be outdone by her sister, gives her handmaid Zilpah to Jacob to bear her another child. Now he is called Gad, meaning a troop. Now they are well on their way to producing a whole football team for Jacob in this hotly contested baby race. Now Leah's handmaid then bears another son, who Leah calls Asher, meaning happy. Next we have the last 3 children of Leah, 2 boys, and finally a girl. Now Reuben is a little boy around 10 years old at this time, and he finds some mandrakes in the field and brings them to his mother Leah. Now mandrakes were believed to be aphrodisiacs at this time. Now while Rachel has 2 legal sons through Bilhah, she still hasn't got one through her own body. She wants the mandrakes and bargains with Leah. Rachel would swap her turn in the marriage bed with Leah for the mandrakes. Now God then reopens Leah's womb and she has a son she calls Issachar, meaning reward or purchased, referring to this deal that she struck for the mandrakes. Now soon after, she has one last son, Zebulon, meaning dwelling. And Leah says, God has endowed me with great endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. Again, you see that ache for her husband's love, which keeps on eluding her. Now Leah also bears a daughter, the only one that Jacob will have, who Leah calls Dinah, a name similar to Dan, which means justice. Now at least God has been good to her and blessed her with children, despite the lack of favour that she gets from Jacob. Now we don't know if the mandrakes had any impact that Rachel brought with Leah, but we finally see that God intervenes and heals Rachel of her barren womb. And she says that God has at last taken away her reproach, the stigma of being barren. Now her name for him, Joseph, expresses ongoing faith that God will continue to bless her in future with another son. And she calls his name Jacob, meaning he shall add. And she says that the Lord shall add to me another son. And it will take another 6 years, but she will have one more son after Jacob leaves Haran and is on her way. They're on their way to see Jacob's father in Hebron. Now, along the way in Bethlehem, she gives birth, and the labour is especially hard. And as her life is slipping away, she calls him Ben-Oni, meaning son of my pain. Now Jacob will rename him to Benjamin after she dies, meaning son of the right hand. So here they all are, the 12 sons of Jacob, who became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now Leah had 6 sons, Rachel had 2 sons, and their concubines each had 2 sons. Now the birthright, or the double portion, usually went with the blessing or the right to patriarchal rule, but unusually the 2 were separated with Joseph's sons. The blessing went to Judah after the first, second and third born sons all disqualified themselves. The birthright, which we'll see in part 2, was given by Jacob to the son who was the other firstborn, the firstborn of his favourite wife, Rachel, even though he was the 11th in birth order amongst the sons of Jacob. Now the odds of having 12 out of 13 children born as sons with only one daughter are quite astronomical, and no doubt God's hand was involved in making that happen. Now the number 12 is biblically significant as the number of organisational beginnings. Now Levi would become the tribe of the priesthood and did not receive a land inheritance. Now when Levi is not counted as one of the 12, often Joseph is counted as 2 tribes, those descended from his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now with both Levi and Ephraim and Manasseh are all counted as full tribes, the number is 13. Now the number 13 is quite significant with the half tribe of Manasseh, just as it is for the United States, which started off as 13 colonies. Now I said before that at another level, when the meaning of those names are strung together, they tell a story about Jacob and the people of God. Now if we flesh out the meaning of those names into meaningful sentences, it reads like this. God sees a son, Reuben, and hears me, Simeon, and has joined me, Levi, to him. Praise the Lord, Judah, for he has judged Dan, and following my wrestling Naphtali, a true Gad comes. Happy am I, Asher, for he has purchased me, Issachar, and will dwell with me, Zebulon. God will add me, Joseph, to the son of his right hand, Benjamin. Now Jacob, of course, will wrestle with God, and he certainly had a whole troop of children. Now Benjamin had his original name, Ben-Oni. You can see how it wouldn't quite work so well here, saying that God will add me to the sum of his pain. Though pain does bring to mind the crucifixion that Jesus endured. Now in the book of Revelation, in chapter 7, we will see a list of names of the tribes with 12,000 each, forming a group of 144,000. Now the order of tribal names is somewhat different in that passage, and it's quite a mystery to a lot of people why one tribe and one half tribe of Joseph are missing on that list. Now in part 3, we'll explore that list and a slightly different story told by the meaning of those names. Now in relation to the missing tribe and the half tribe, I will give you a hint why those two are missing. There's something to do with what the Bible refers to as the sins of Jeroboam. Now after the tabernacle was built at Mount Sinai, the 12 tribes of Israel were arranged around the tabernacle as per this diagram here. Now the Levites were in the centre around the tabernacle. Now Joseph is split into Ephraim and Manasseh, and with Benjamin formed three tribes on each side. Now there were 4 lead tribes of Israel, Judah and Joseph, who faced each other. Now Judah is the scepter or ruling tribe. Joseph is the birthright tribe. Now the other 2 leading tribes were Reuben and Dan. Now, Reuben, of course, was the firstborn of all sons, and Dan was the firstborn of the 4 sons born from the handmaids of Leah and Rachel. Now when we think of a patriarchy today, we might think of the British royal family, ruled by the Grand Patriarch Queen Elizabeth II, or many of the great aristocratic families. Now to better understand the story of the patriarchs from Abraham down to Joseph, it's helpful to understand the cultural background of the customs of patriarchal households at this time. Now a patriarchal household would look something like this. The patriarch would generally be the oldest son of the deceased father. Now if they hadn't been given leave by the patriarch, living with the household would also be the brothers of the patriarch and their families. Now married sons of the patriarch, so long as they are in the same geographical area, would not set up their own household but would continue to live with and be under the father's patriarchal authority. Now a daughter, when she would marry, would leave her own family and come under the authority of her husband and his patriarch. Now servants, including their wives and children, would not just be under the authority of the patriarch, but would also be considered part of the family. Now in the time of the patriarchs, when the patriarch dies, either the oldest son or another son that the patriarch has chosen will replace him as the new patriarch. Now the patriarch legally had authority over all the property of those in authority over. Now remember, Jacob served 14 years for his wives. He says to Laban in Genesis 30, when he asks for permission to leave, "Give me my wives and my children." Now later in Genesis 31:43, after Laban catches up with Jacob, he says, "This flock is my flock, and all that you see is mine." Now a patriarchal society would not leave without seeking the consent of the patriarch. Now if Laban adopted Jacob as a son, this explains why Jacob never sets up his own household, but remains under Laban's authority. Laban then gave Jacob a counter-offer that he agreed to. Now a patriarch may choose to send his sons or brothers far away enough and gift them with whatever he chooses to give them, and they will then become a patriarch of a new household. Now we see an example of this in Genesis 25:6, in the life of Abraham with his sons of Keturah, the wife that he had after Sarah died. It says that he gave them gifts and sent them eastward to become patriarchs of their own, so they would not be under Isaac's authority once he died. And this would give them legal authority over the inheritance that he gave them. Now when Jacob was away, Isaac, expecting Jacob to return at some stage, must have decided it was best to send Esau away so he would not need to be under Jacob's lawful authority when he died, given how he cheated Esau to gain that right to become patriarch. Now Isaac tried to make good of a bad situation as Esau went to Mount Seir, and he became very rich by the time that Jacob returns. Now Richard Page notes that there are a number of oddities in the story of Jacob during his time in Haran that can be neatly explained if Jacob was not just the son-in-law, but the adopted son of Laban. Now this solution to these oddities was originally proposed by Edwin Campbell and David Freeman in their book, The Biblical Archaeologist Reader, after studying ancient tablets uncovered at Mizzou. Now when a patriarch had no sons, he could take a servant of his household and make him heir. We saw that with Eliezer, who Abraham told God would be his heir before he had any sons. Now a servant could be adopted and be considered part of the family, even more than a blood relative who was in the land but not directly under the authority of the patriarch. Now another custom of the time, if he had daughters but no sons, is that he could take a son-in-law and adopt him as a son, making him the heir of his property. Now a condition of this arrangement was that the adopted son was bound not to take another wife outside of the household. Now the patriarch wants to ensure that the inheritance goes to the children of that union and not to those of another wife. Now Laban insists on this after he and Jacob made a covenant after Jacob fled from Haran. Now for Laban, he would have been delighted to adopt someone who was already of the same bloodline as Jacob already was. Now that adds more significance to Laban's statement on meeting Jacob, where he says, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." Now at the time that Jacob is about to flee from Laban, there is mention of the sons of Laban that he had, but it would appear that they were not born for some time after Jacob arrived. Now this is implied in the statement from Leah and Rachel. Is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Now as daughters, they would have had no right to an inheritance unless it came to them via Jacob as an adopted son. But now Laban has his own sons, and the inheritance now reverts from Jacob to those new sons. Now in Genesis 31:2 it says, "And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favourable toward him as before." Now Laban has been deceitful towards him all along, so what does Jacob mean that it was not as it was before? Well, as his heir, he would have been more positive towards him than later when Laban had his own sons and one of them takes over as his heir. Now he didn't have to be under his patriarchal authority as a son-in-law, but Jacob would have been as his son. So we see that Jacob formally has to ask for permission to leave. Now if Jacob were just a son-in-law in his household, he wouldn't need to ask for permission to leave. He does as a son. Now the United Church of God Bible Reading Program has this to say about the deal which Jacob struck with Laban. Now Laban was eager to have Jacob remain, for God had blessed everything. Jacob did well in Laban's household, and Laban has grown rich. Name me your wages and I'll give it. And Jacob took out the coloured and the spotted sheep and gave them to Laban, whose sons took them away a distance of 3 days' journey. Now this left Jacob with only the pure white sheep. Now the last clause of verse 32, "and these shall be my wages," is a little confusing. Now the Hebrew literally says, "and it shall be in the future my wages." Now Jacob is not saying that the spotted and the coloured sheep that he removed from the flock would be his wages. Instead, Jacob was saying that in the future, any spotted or coloured sheep born in the flock that Jacob would tend to would be his wages. But this seemed impossible to Laban. Jacob was only left with only the white sheep. So how could white sheep bear spotted and coloured sheep? Well, that is why Laban so hastily agreed to the deal. Now the beginning of verse 33 is most important. "So my righteousness will answer for me in the time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you." Now this telling declaration marks a profound advancement in Jacob's character development. When Jacob arrived in Padan Aram, he was a grasping, manipulator who relied upon his own innate abilities and craft to obtain what he wanted. But 14 years of service for Laban, during which Laban consistently outwitted him, and during which God had blessed him in all he did, had produced a change in Jacob. He had now progressed to the point where he relied upon his righteous conduct to secure blessings and promise prosperity from God. That is a dramatic change of heart, a major development in right character. End of quote. Now Jacob then takes the white extract from the branches of almond and chestnut trees. And he possibly might have ground them into a powder form and put them in the water of those animals he wants to breed. Now this is thought to be an aid to conception or aphrodisiac like the mandrakes we looked at before. Now God miraculously intervened and produced streaked, spotted and speckled sheep from a purebred sheep. And in the next chapter, Jacob tells Rachel and Leah, "You know with all my might I have served your father, yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow it to hurt me. If he said thus, the speckle shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, the streak shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked. So God has taken away all the livestock of your father and given them to me. The angel of God spoke to me in a dream, and he said, lift your eyes now and see all the rams which sleep on the flocks are streaked, speckled, and grey spotted, for I've seen all that Laban is doing to you." Now this brings us to the second lesson which we can learn from Jacob's life. Be an honest, hard worker, just as Jacob came to be. Now Jacob was a diligent and a very skilled worker. After arriving as a grasping manipulator, his years of service under his deceitful uncle Laban saw him become an honest worker where he relied upon his righteous conduct in his work to secure blessings and prosperity from God. Now, his work ethic after the change that came over him is a great example for us to emulate. Now, after 6 more years, came to a head leading to Jacob, deciding to finally leave Laban and head back to Canaan. Now, in Genesis 31 we read, "Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all this wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favourable toward him as it was before. And the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field to his flock, and said to them, I see your father's countenance, and is not favourable towards me as it was before. But the God of my father has been with me. God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. And the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar, and where you made a vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your father. All the new animals are going to Jacob. Now as Laban loses animals, his are not being replaced sufficiently to cover his losses. Now Laban now has sons who are probably between 10 and 15 years old. Now God addresses himself in Jacob's dream as the God of Bethel. Now appearing to him now, God shows him that he is not just local to the land of Canaan, but he has been working with and blessing him hundreds of miles away in Bethel in Haran, from Bethel in Haran. Now in the ancient world, God was seen as local and territorial to a particular area. Now as daughters, Rachel and Leah would have had no right to an inheritance unless it came by Jacob as an adopted son. But now Laban has his own sons, and the inheritance now reverts from Jacob to those new sons. Now Rachel and Leah have plenty of unkind things to say about their father's conduct, and agree that they should do as God says, and leave Laban, which they do without telling him. They leave Haran in the area of Padan Aram, intending to go to Jacob's father, Isaac, in Hebron. Now Laban is not told until the third day that they have left, and he pursues them all the way to the hill country of Gilead on the east side of the Jordan River, where he catches up to them after pursuing them for 7 days. Now Jacob and his whole party have covered the 400 miles in about 10 days, averaging 40 miles or 60 kilometres a day. Now Laban's party has covered the distance even faster, more likely on horseback. Now notice that it says that Rachel stole Laban's household idols. Now later in the same chapter, in verse 53, the true God is referred to as the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of Terah. Yet in Joshua 24:2 it says that your fathers, including Terah, served other gods. Now when I spoke about Abraham, we saw how there was mixed worship of the true God and false gods within the family line in Haran. Now is Rachel following in their example? Possibly. Though once Jacob becomes a patriarch of his own, he'll stop this mixed worship in his clan. Now Rachel may have still worshipped the idols, but possibly, and more likely, she might have viewed those idols called teraphim in Hebrew as talisman or objects, superstitiously thought to protect them from harm or illness. Now after Laban catches up with him, Jacob has it out with Laban over his deceitful and greedy conduct, and asserts that God has been looking after him, and Laban was rebuked in the dream that he had the night before. Now Laban finally acquiesces to allowing Jacob to depart and makes a covenant with Jacob for both not to pass to the other side of the heap of stones or hurt each other. And notice twice in that passage that God is referred to as the fear of Isaac. Now fear here means dread or terror. Now is this one of God's names? Or was there a sense of fearful dread in the way that Isaac related to God that Jacob had seen growing up? Now Laban departs peacefully, but now Jacob is deeply worried about the reaction of Esau, who last time they saw each other had said that he would kill him. So one problem down, one to go. Now Genesis 32 starts with an unusual encounter. In verses 1 and 2 it says, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." And he called the name of that place Mahanaim. The word Mahanaim means two camps. Now Adam Clark in his commentary offers this reason for this angelic encounter with Jacob. The angelic host which Jacob met with him the night before might have inspired him with sufficient confidence in God's protection. End quote. And then we read, then Jacob sent messages before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, "Speak thus to my lord Esau. Thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, and male and female servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I may find favour in your sight." Then the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he is also coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." So Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks and herds and camels into two companies. And he said, "If Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company which is left will escape." Now he knows that God has promised to protect him and bring him back safely, yet his guilty conscience over what he's done to Esau in the past is getting the better of him, and he's fearing the worst. Now Esau may have told the messengers that he comes to Jacob in peace, which Jacob may or may not have thought was a ruse. But prudently though, Jacob divides his party up into two camps if Esau does intend to harm them. And he rose that night and took his wives, his two female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of Jabbok. He took them, sent them over the brook, and sent over what he had. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of day. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But he said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked, saying, "Tell me your name, I pray." And he said, "Why is that you ask about my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Now Jacob is alone when out of the darkness someone starts wrestling with him, and this goes on for hours. A person who Jacob later recognises as God wrestled with Jacob for a whole night, testing Jacob's tenacity. And again, he also may have enjoyed the wrestle. Now Jacob kept going even when his hip was out of joint and would not let go until God blessed him. And we see here that God gives Jacob a new name, Israel. Now the name Israel includes the verb for strive, as well as the Hebrew sar, meaning prince. So it can mean both overcomer, or one who strives with God, or it can mean prince with God. Now God told Jacob, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel." Yet after this, he is called Jacob 56 times, and Israel 40 times in the rest of the book of Genesis. So why is Jacob still used, unlike Abraham and Sarai, after their names were changed? Well, Jacob would be no more considered a hill catcher or supplanter of others, but an overcomer with God, even though he will still be called by his original personal name. Now Rashi's commentary on this passage is, people will no longer say about you that you received the blessings through trickery and deceit, the meaning of Jacob, but rather striving and openly. And the second possibility is that Jacob would no longer be known by the name Jacob only. Now Abraham ibn Ezra's comment on this passage is, "Henceforth you shall not be called Jacob exclusively, but also Israel." Now is there a pattern when Jacob is used and when Israel is used? Well, Herbert Block in his paper distinguishing Jacob and Israel gives a number of examples suggesting when Jacob is used, it is used in association with when he is timid and passive, and when Israel is used, he is assertive and proactive. Now Jacob was a compliant person, easily swayed by stronger characters like his mother and Laban. Now he would develop into a more determined man who recognised the need for strong, positive action. Now we've seen Jacob's growing faith as he trusted in God to bless him despite Laban's trickery. At this time, when he's fearful about Esau's potential vengeance, Jacob tenaciously clung onto God with every fibre of his being. While he does his part, he knows how deeply he needs God and tenaciously clings onto and seeks God's help and blessing. Now this brings us to our third lesson from Jacob's life. Tenaciously hold on to and depend on God, just like Jacob did. Now to do so, we need to recognise how desperately we need God's help and power in our life to overcome our sins and to be more like God. Now the understanding of the meaning of the names of Israel and Judah is important because the Apostle Paul will make an important distinction between physical and spiritual Israel, and also between physical and spiritual Judah in the book of Romans. And it's actually a play on the meaning of these names. In Romans 9:6, Paul says, "For they are not all Israel who are of Israel." Now true spiritual Israelites are those who will truly become princes or overcomers with God. In Romans 2:28 and 29, Paul makes a distinction between physical Jews descended from Judah and spiritual Jews when he says that a true spiritual Jew is one inwardly and whose praise is not of men but of God. Now spiritual Jews are those worthy of the praise of God. Now as I noted earlier, when Jacob was away, Esau, expecting Jacob to return, must have decided it was best to send Esau away so he would not need to be under Jacob's lawful authority when he died. Now Isaac tried to make good of a bad situation as Esau went to Mount Seir and became very rich by the time Jacob returns. Now this helped take the wind out of Esau's desire to avenge himself on Jacob. Now he actually had what he thought he'd lost to Jacob. Esau was now a patriarch in his own right, separate from Jacob, and he was also very prosperous. Now after the deception that Jacob did with his father, his mother Rebekah said to him, "Stay with Laban a few days until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's and he forgets what you've done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there." Now Rebekah promised to send word to Jacob when Esau's fury had eased and have him brought home. Now there's no indication that she made good on this promise to Jacob. Now Rebekah is not mentioned anymore in Genesis except in Genesis 49, where it says she was buried in Hebron. Now we don't know when Rebekah died, but it appears to have been before Jacob returned to Canaan. Now there's no mention of Rebekah sending anyone to let Jacob know that Isaac had sent Esau away to be a patriarch of his own, nor is there any mention of a reunion between Rebekah and her favourite son, Jacob. Now in Genesis 33 we read, "Now Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and there Esau was coming, and with him were 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two maidservants. And he put the maidservants and their children in front, Leah and her children behind, and Rachel and Joseph last. Then he crossed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted his eyes and saw the women and children and said, 'Who are these with you?' So he said, 'The children whom God has graciously given to your servant.' Then Esau said, 'What do you mean by all this company which I meet?' And he said, 'These are to find favour in the sight of my Lord.' But Esau said, 'I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself.' And Jacob said, 'No, please, if I found favour in your sight, then receive my present from my hand.' And Jacob then says, 'Please let my Lord go on before his servant. I will lead on slowly at a pace which the livestock that go before me and the children are able to endure, until I come to meet my Lord in Seir.' So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir." So we see that Esau's desire to avenge himself on Jacob has passed, given he is now a rich patriarch. So he's very glad to see his brother Jacob after being away for 20 years. Now Jacob would have been so incredibly relieved and delighted his brother is happy to see him again and wants to do him good and no harm. It would have been a very joyful time indeed for Jacob. So on that happy note, we'll conclude part 2 of lessons from Jacob. Now in part 3, we'll examine the rest of his story in Canaan, from Shechem to Bethel and on to Hebron to see his father. We'll look at how his favourite son was sold by his brothers and yet ends up becoming the vizier over Egypt, which leads to the whole family moving from Canaan to Egypt. And we'll also look more into the prophecies and the purpose of the nation that God would raise up through Jacob and his 12 sons. Well, happy Sabbath to you all, and welcome back to the Bible Biography channel. Now, it's taken me a fair while to get back up here, but I've finally got the chance now to finish off with you the story of the great patriarch Jacob. Now, so far in this look at the life of Jacob, whose other name was Israel, we've looked at the first 2 major phases of his life. We looked at his first 77 years in the land of Canaan. That concluded with the deception that he pulled on his father to gain the blessing of patriarchal rule, which was prophesied to his mother just before he was born. Now, he was then sent up to Haran to find a wife at age 77. And he spent the next 20 years there and ended up with not just 1, but 2 wives following the deception that Laban did to him. Now, through his 2 wives and 2 more concubines, he fathered 12 children before returning to the land of Canaan. Now, we finished last time with Jacob being reunited with Esau on the eastern side of the Jordan River on his way back from Haran. Now, after the union with Esau, Jacob then headed west and crossed over the Jordan. Now, his first major port of call was the city of Shechem in the central highlands of Israel. Now, Shechem is a variation of Shalom, meaning peace. Now, this site is dripping with Bible history, as it was Abraham's first stopping point in the land of Canaan, and also later where the Israelites would renew their covenant with God, with 6 tribes saying amen to the blessings on the mountain on the left in this photo, and 6 saying amen to the curses on the mountain here on the right-hand side. Now, Jacob buys a parcel of land here where he pitches his tent and erects an altar. Now, Matthew Henry on this passage writes, though the land of Canaan was his by promise, yet the time for taking possession not having come yet, he is content to pay for his own to prevent disputes with the present occupants. End of quote. Now, wherever the patriarchs went, they may have often been in the religious zone of the town, signified by the sacred trees we looked at when I spoke about lessons from Abraham. But they always built their own altars to sacrifice to God and never used a pre-existing pagan one. Now, Israelite altars were always made with uncut stones, with ramps rather than steps, as is common to Canaanite altars. Now, the name of the altar that Jacob or Israel gives to the altar, when translated here, reads God, the God of Israel. Now, he has now fully committed himself to a relationship with the true God and not just his father's God. Now, when Jacob lived in Shechem, he dug a well for himself and his family and livestock to drink from. Now, where Jacob bought a plot of land would be somewhere between the locations noted as Jacob's well and Joseph's tomb, seen in the bottom of the labelled aerial photo here on the left. Now, the ancient city or Tel is today called Tel Balata, just to the west of Joseph's tomb, or just above it on the photo on the left here. Now, there isn't a reference to Jacob's well in the book of Genesis, but we read about it in the book of John, where Jesus meets a Samaritan woman there. Now, there's a well there today that's believed to have been the same well that both Jesus and Jacob drank from, that you can visit and drink from if you visit there, which today is within a church building. Now, this well is around about 40 metres deep. Now, what happens next while they're living at Shechem can only be described as a complete and utter disaster. Now, Jacob's only daughter, Dinah, goes to see the daughters of the land. Now, she's got 11 brothers and no sisters, so it's quite understandable that she seeks out female friends amongst the locals. Now, Dinah is about the same age as Joseph, who was 6 when they moved back to Canaan. So it appears that several years have passed and she's probably now in her mid-teens. Now, the son of the prince, who is called by the same name of the town, Shechem, took and lay with her and violated her. Now, it also says he defiled her and did a disgraceful thing. Now, commentators disagree over whether this was a rape or just premarital sex. Now, no blame is ascribed to Dinah, so if it is a consensual act, Shechem gets the primary blame for seducing her, perhaps with the aid of giving Dinah too much alcohol. Now, Shechem spoke kindly to her even after the act and aches to have her as his wife. Now, this sort of strong romantic attraction is uncommon for someone to have after they have raped someone. We can contrast his attitude with that of David's son Amnon, who wanted nothing to do with his half-sister Tamar after he raped her. Now, further, Shechem seemed very willing to meet all the demands of Dinah's brothers in order to marry her, as painful as those conditions would turn out to be. Now, Shechem's father proposes a political alliance or amalgamation of the two tribes to be sealed by intermarriage. Now, he offers to make them joint possessors of the soil and of the rights of dwelling, trading and acquiring property. Now, for them to become a part of the family of Abraham required them to be circumcised, which they agreed to do. Now, the Shechemites were possibly persuaded to go through with it because the prospect of sharing in the wealth of Jacob's family, which was quite considerable. The Shechemites agreed to the deal and get circumcised. Jacob agrees to this covenant, yet there is no record of him seeking God's advice as to whether this was a good idea or not. Now, given later prohibitions against covenants with the Canaanites, it is highly likely that God would have said no to this alliance with a Canaanite tribe. Now, on the third day, while they were in pain from their circumcision, Simeon and Levi led an assault on the town of Shechem, killing not just the one who defiled Dinah, but went completely overboard with their revenge killing his father and perhaps many more, taking their wives and children captive and plundering all their wealth. Now, we don't know how many of the other brothers joined in, or if Simeon and Levi just arranged for a number of their servants to help with their bloodthirsty raid. After being rebuked by Jacob, Simeon and Levi are still unrepentant and think their actions were justified for what was done, which was quite outrageous since the evil was only done by Shechem, who genuinely tried to make up for what he had done wrong. Now, that wrong was not done by the others Simeon and Levi have killed and robbed. I mean, they were consumed by the same type of satanic mob spirit that goes all the way back to Satan's rebellion against God. Now, how often have we seen mobs or riots break out after a perceived or real injustice, where that act is then used as an excuse to do far worse in return, and as an excuse for every type of assault and robbery against others who are completely innocent of the supposed injustice? Now, Jacob rebuked them and he said, "You have troubled me by making me obnoxious amongst the inhabitants of the land, and they will gather themselves together to take revenge upon the whole family and kill them." Now, in verse 5 of the next chapter, it says, "The terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob." Now, luckily for them, their fear of Jacob's clan and their God was much greater than any desire for revenge. Now, God then speaks to Jacob and tells him to go to Bethel and make an altar there. Now, Jacob will go there to renew his covenant with God and instructs everyone in his household to purify themselves and to put away the foreign gods that are amongst them, which Jacob buries under a tree at Shechem. Now, Jacob has been a patriarch for at least 7 years at this stage, so he's been somewhat passive to this point in dealing with the mixed worship in his household that is carried over from his time in Haran. Now, in the light of the disaster with the Shechemites, he acts decisively to purge out all the idols and fully dedicate his household to the worship of only the true God. Now, from there, he travels to Bethel and builds an altar to sacrifice to God. Now, this brings us to our fourth lesson that we can learn from Jacob. Purge out worldly influences the way that Jacob had his clan put away their foreign idols. Now, it can be a little bit of a shock to find out just how much of our sinful society sometimes affects the way that we think, our viewpoints, our language, the way we dress and treat others when we study the Bible and look into God's values and his way of doing things. Now, there's one example that I read about when someone stopped watching TV for a few months and just read the Bible and good spiritual books. He then gradually started watching TV again, and he was quite shocked at how disturbing subtle things were that he had not noticed before. Now, we should educate our conscience thoroughly in God's ways and values and guard our minds from worldly influences that conflict with God's values. Now, at Bethel, where God first appeared to Jacob, in his Stairway to Heaven vision, God repeats his renaming of Jacob with the new name of Israel. Now, he reaffirms with Jacob the promises he made to Abraham and Isaac about his descendants inheriting the land. Now, God gives again the promise of a line of kings that he gave to Abraham in Genesis 17. But in reaffirming the promise of national blessing, God adds something mentioned for the first time in Scripture, something new. The promise of a single nation and a company or group of nations. Now this begs the question, when in Israel's ancient history, as recorded in the Bible, did Israel ever become a nation and a company of nations? Now this never happened in the history of Israel recorded in the Bible. There were only ever two nations after they split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah following the death of Solomon. Now someone might argue that nation here only means tribe, and it was fulfilled after the split when Judah was in the south and the 10 tribes were in the north. Well, we'll see that nation goes out the window a little later in Genesis 48, when Jacob will pass on the birthright promise to Joseph's 2 sons. And he would prophesy that just Joseph's son Ephraim would become this company of nations. Now from Bethel, Jacob's household continues further south. Along the way, close to Bethlehem, Rachel goes into hard labour. Now sadly, the birth was very hard on Rachel, and she dies shortly after his birth. Now after her life is slipping away, she renames him Ben-Oni, meaning son of my pain. Now probably after she died, Jacob renamed his youngest son to Benjamin, meaning son of the right hand. Now Rachel was his favourite wife and he deeply loved her, so this tragic event would have been terribly hard on Jacob. Now what is a little unusual is that Jacob buried his favourite wife where she died about a mile north of Bethlehem, rather than take her body to be buried at Hebron in the family tomb where Abraham and Sarah were buried, which would have been no more than a day's journey away. Now Jacob set up a pillar on her grave, and it worked out, perhaps from God's guidance, that this place afterwards fell in the lot of Benjamin when Israel was divided up by Lot. Now, the tragic event of Rachel's death is then quickly followed by the shameful incident in which Reuben defiles his father's bed by sleeping with Bilhah, the mother of his brothers Dan and Naphtali. Now, according to 1 Chronicles 5 verse 1, this sin of Reuben is what caused Israel to give the birthright to Joseph instead. So not only was this a sin of defilement and adultery, it had long-lasting consequences on future events, determining the ultimate recipients of the promises of wealth that God had made to Abraham. Now, according to some scholars who have traced the migrations of the northern tribes after their Israel into Assyria, Reuben and Joseph's descendants would carve out large empires during the colonial era of empire, with Joseph's descendants defeating Reuben's descendants on both sea and land to win a much greater empire. Now, in fact, if the views on who their descendants came to be is correct, then we here in Australia would most likely be speaking a different language had Reuben not committed this sin. Now, before I started preparing the series, I'd assumed that Isaac had probably already died before Jacob had come back to the land and was reunited with Esau. But Isaac did in fact live long enough to see his sons reunited. Now, it was probably about 7 years since Jacob has returned to Canaan. Now, I suspect that he probably saw his father prior to this particular visit, which seems to be a more extended visit for many years until the death of his father. Now from verse 27 we read the following. Then Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had dwelt. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. So Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So we see here both his sons, Jacob and Esau, are there to help bury him in the ancestral burial site, the Machpelah cave in Hebron. Now remember that Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. So Jacob here is now 120 years old. Now remember too that Jacob was 91 years old when he gave his son Joseph was born. So, how old is Joseph when his grandfather Isaac dies? Well, if we do the maths, 120 minus 91 means that Joseph is now 29 years old. Hang on, we haven't even got to the story of Joseph yet in Genesis, being sold into slavery, where he was just 17 and went to Egypt. How do we explain this? Well, obviously, not everything in the book of Genesis is chronological. Now, Jacob was 97 when he moved back to Canaan, and now we have jumped forward to 23 years later, when Jacob is 120 years old. So if Joseph is 29 years old at this time, then he is in prison in Egypt, a year before his stunning promotion to vizier when his grandfather Isaac dies. Now there's a recurring phrase throughout the book of Genesis. It's the expression, "these are the generations of." Now the Hebrew here for generations is the word toledoth, which means history, in particular a family history. Now P.J. Wiseman found out that most of the ancient clay tablets in Mesopotamia have what are called colophon phrases at the end, which name the writer or owner of the tablet. They had words to identify the subject, and often some sort of dating phrase. Now if the story was told over multiple tablets, there are also these catch lines to connect a tablet to the next one in the sequence. Now many of these records related to family histories and origins. Now Wiseman noted the similarity of many of these to the sections of the book of Genesis. Now in 1936 he published his book Ancient Records and the Structure of Genesis, which promoted his ancient tablet theory that the history of the ancient people in the book of Genesis was compiled originally on tablets written by different authors over the generations, which were then handed down through the family line over the centuries. Moses was then able to compile the text of the original tablets, no longer extant, onto a single parchment scroll that we know as Genesis. Now Wiseman suggests that from Genesis 37 on, that one of Jacob's sons continued on a new tablet with the story of Joseph, hence why we then go back in time to Joseph's teenage years after the death of Isaac and the story of Esau's family in Genesis 36. Now the story of Joseph, apart from his birth, begins in Genesis 37. Now Joseph was 17 at the time, and in verse 3 it states that Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children. It states he made him a tunic of many colours. Now following Reuben's adultery with Jacob's concubine and the previous actions of Simeon and Levi, it is likely at this stage that Jacob intended to pass on the birthright to the firstborn son of his favourite wife, who was Joseph. Now when people are given a title, they are often given special garments, and the act of giving the garments and a title is referred to as an investiture or being invested. Now the coat of Joseph was given may have been a symbol from Jacob intending to pass on to him the birthright instead of giving it to Judah or the other brothers. Now, the special treatment that Jacob gives to Joseph over his brothers goes over like a lead balloon with his brothers, who begin to hate and envy him. Now, when we look at Joseph in the next sermon in this series, we'll look at evidence that leans towards the possibility that a palace and a statue found at Tel el-Daba in the Nile Delta may well be that of Joseph. Now, the traces of colour on the statue that they found there, shown here in the bottom right, indicates the colours of the multi-striped coat of the dignitary of that statue were red, blue and gold. Now, ironically, these are the same colours of today's British royal family. So it is possible that these are the colours of Joseph's multicoloured coat or tunic. Now, Joseph's dreams of the brothers and his parents bowing down and paying homage to him further then added fuel to the fire of the brothers' hatred of Joseph. Now, Jacob has been spending much of his time in Hebron at this time, where his elderly and blind father Isaac is. But he still has flocks up in Shechem, where he sends a number of his sons to tend, except for Joseph. Now, Jacob wants to know how the sons are going up in Shechem, and so he sends Joseph up to Shechem to bring back word. Now, previously, he's been given a bad report of the sons of Jacob's concubines. The sons have now gone further north to the town of Dothan. Now, you can see here a picture of Tel Dothan overlooking the valley of Dothan. Now, the other biblical claim to fame of this particular location is that this was actually where Elisha was when he and his servants were given that vision of angels on chariots of fire. Now, the sons then conspired to kill him. Now, Reuben was okay with the part about casting him into a pit or well, as he hoped to go back and rescue him later. Now, Reuben at this stage is probably feeling a lot of guilt for the hurt that he's caused his father with his sexual relationship with Bilhah, and doesn't want to add to that. Now, the brothers cast him into the pit. Now, as the brothers were eating, Judah, after seeing a caravan of traders heading to Egypt, pipes up and says, "Why kill him? Let's make a bit of money and sell him as a slave to these traders." Now, Reuben, for some reason, was away from the brothers at the time of this transaction, and he then goes back to the pit to rescue Joseph, only to find out that they had sold him off into slavery. Now, rather than turning them in, sadly, Reuben goes along with their deception to make out as if Joseph had been killed by a wild animal, which devastates poor old Jacob when he is told. Now, Joseph, upon his arrival to Egypt, is sold to Potiphar, an officer and captain of the guard. Now, while Jacob's sons were at fault in this tragedy, Jacob could have lessened the possibility of this event occurring had he not shown so much favouritism to Joseph. Now, this brings us to lesson 5 that we can learn from Jacob's life. Don't play favourites with your children. It's not fair on the less favoured ones, and it can lead to resentment and envy amongst one's children. Now, this is a lesson that Jacob should have learned from his parents' mistake of favouring one son over the other, and the enmity that it helped to foster. Now, I mentioned when I spoke about Isaac that this lesson reminded me of a Suncorp commercial where rugby league star Jonathan Thurston appeared in. Now, there was some competition about picking your favourite state of origin game, and he commented that trying to do so was like trying to pick your favourite child. He then cheekily said with a smile, "You've got one, you're just not allowed to say." Now, we will cover the remaining chapters of Genesis in much more detail when I get into lessons from Joseph. So I'm only going to briefly summarise the remaining chapters. Now, after many years serving Potiphar very well and being blessed in his household, he is then thrown unfairly into prison over a false rape charge against Potiphar's wife. Now, he then correctly gives the interpretation of two of Potiphar's servants' dreams. Now, while the cupbearer loses his life, the butler is restored to his position as interpreted by Joseph. Now, a couple of years later, Pharaoh has a dream of 7 fat cows and 7 thin cows eating up 7 fat cows, and another similar dream. After another similar dream, the butler remembers Joseph, and the Pharaoh has him brought in to interpret the dream after no one can interpret the dream. Now, Joseph tells him that there will be 7 years of great plenty, followed by 7 years of great famine, and suggests a detailed plan to Pharaoh to save a fifth of the food in the years of plenty, so there is grain to get them through the famine. Now, the Pharaoh was then so impressed that he elevated Joseph to next in authority under him over Egypt, a position that is called a vizier in Egypt. Now, in the second year of famine, Jacob sends 10 of his sons, with the exception of Benjamin, to go and buy grain from Egypt. Now, Joseph recognises them, but they don't recognise him, as he acts as a stranger and speaks roughly to them. Now, partly as payback and partly to test and humble his brothers who sent him into slavery, Joseph puts them through all sorts of tests that we'll look at when I speak about Joseph. Now, eventually, Joseph can't hold it back any longer. He weeps uncontrollably, sends out his servants, and tells the brothers that he is Joseph. Now, this would have been such an incredibly emotional scene that is well portrayed in the Time Life movie about Joseph, starring Aussie actor Paul Mercurio, better known from the movie Strictly Ballroom. Now, Joseph shows mercy and forgiveness to his brothers, telling them that it was God's will that he was to go to Egypt and to be put into a position to preserve life. Now, there are still 5 years of famine to go, and Joseph tells them to let Jacob know that he is still alive and being made vizier over Egypt, and to bring him and his family down to Egypt. Now, Jacob is likely in Hebron at this time, though he may have still been in Shechem, when he was given the unbelievable news that Joseph is still both alive and also vizier over Egypt. Now, God then encourages him in a dream to go to Egypt. He then makes a sacrifice of Bathsheba on the way and moves his whole household down to Egypt. Now, it would have been an incredible reunion between Jacob and Joseph after Jacob thought for over a decade that Joseph was dead. I mean, what an amazing happy ending to the story of Jacob's life, to be reunited with Joseph the last 17 years of his life that he will spend in Egypt. Now, when I spoke about Abraham, we looked at the question of what the occupation was of the patriarchs, as it was generally assumed that patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, were just shepherds or herders of livestock. Now, if they were just shepherds, the following passage in Genesis 46 would seem a bit out of place. Now, Joseph says to his brothers, "If the Pharaoh asks you what your occupation is, I want you to tell him that you tend livestock." He then says that shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. Now, if they were just shepherds or herders of livestock already, why would Joseph feel the need to prep his brothers and father to give a particular answer? Now, it would seem that there was much more to what they did as a living than just herders of livestock. Joseph tells them to just focus on this one part of their overall business so that the Pharaoh will give you the land of Goshen. Now, the land of Goshen is a very fertile part of Egypt and the eastern part of the Nile Delta, which is where Jacob and his family and Joseph will also settle. Now back in Genesis 35, God expanded the promise of national greatness when Jacob had returned to Bethel. Now the promise of national greatness started off as a great nation that would come from Abraham, and then many nations would come to him. And then in Genesis 35, God expanded that to a nation and a company of nations. Now this particular promise of a nation and a company of nations we find now in Genesis 48 is not meant for 11 of Jacob's 12 sons. It is specifically passed on to just Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now Joseph was the second youngest son of Jacob. He was in fact Jacob's 11th born son. So how did Joseph end up with the birthright if he was the 11th born? Well, he also happened to be the firstborn of Jacob's favourite wife, Rachel. So when Reuben disqualified himself, the birthright was transferred from the firstborn of his first wife to the firstborn of his favourite wife. Now Jacob, in blessing the two sons of Joseph in Genesis 48:19, said that one son, Manasseh, would become a great nation, and his other son, Ephraim, would become a multitude, or we could say a commonwealth of nations. Now before the Assyrian captivity, the tribe of Joseph's son Ephraim was never a multitude of nations. It was originally a tribe within the United Nation of Israel, and then the northern kingdom of Israel after Solomon. So this can only be a prophecy for after they went into captivity at the hands of the Assyrians. Now notice here it says that Jacob says that the younger son Ephraim was to be the greater. Now when the tribe of Joseph occupied the promised land up to the time of the Assyrian captivity, it was always Manasseh who had the much greater territory in the land than Ephraim. So that itself implies that this is a future prophecy after the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom. Now a common mistake that people make is assuming that all Israelites are Jews. Now the name Jew comes from the name of the tribe of Judah. Now Judah was only just one of the 12 tribes of Israel. In fact, most Israelites are not Jews, in the same way that not all British people are English, and not all Americans come from California. Now after Solomon's death, the nation split into two kingdoms, ruled by two different kings. Now after the split, the term Jew would expand to include those of the tribe of Benjamin that stayed loyal to the king of Judah, as well as the Levites who lived in that southern kingdom. However, the term Jew was never applied to those who were part of the 10 tribes that broke away and formed the northern kingdom of Israel. Now that also included the birthright tribes of Joseph and the two half-tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Now critics of the view that the descendants of the 10 tribes that formed the northern kingdom migrated to Europe or some other place, apart from the Jews, claim one of two things. They claim that either the northern tribes mixed in and became fully incorporated with the Jews after the Assyrian conquest, or that in their exile they became fully bred out amongst the Gentile peoples and are no longer a distinct people. Now both of these views are disproven by a millennial prophecy given to us in Ezekiel 37. Now after Jesus Christ returns and brings the kingdom of God to earth, the two houses of Israel, signified by its chief tribe Joseph and Judah, will be politically reunited under King David, who will have to be resurrected since he lived long after Ezekiel. Now this proves that the northern tribes were not bred out of existence, and it also proves that the house of Israel have remained distinct from the Jews who are of the house of Judah. Now the northern kingdom of Israel went into captivity at the hand of the cruel Assyrians around 700 BC, with those taken away resettled in the Assyrian Empire. Now we read in 2 Kings 17 verses 18 to 20. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah alone. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, afflicted them, and delivered them into the hand of the plunderers until he had cast them from his sight. Now many of the Israelites may have voluntarily left the northern kingdom before the captivity when they saw the handwriting on the wall and the Assyrians were about to invade, just as many Jews fled Germany prior to World War II. Now Phoenician colonies like Carthage and Tarshish in Spain could have possibly accommodated them at that time. Now also a small remnant fled as refugees to the southern kingdom. However, the vast majority were taken away into captivity into Assyria and Media. Now we see the real importance of knowing where the descendants of the northern kingdom of Israel migrated to in the book of Jeremiah. Now in Jeremiah 30, verses 3 to 9, we read this future prophecy. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will bring back from captivity my people Israel and Judah, says the Lord. And I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. And it is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. For it shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord, that I will break his yoke from your neck and will burst your bonds. Foreigners shall no more enslave them, but they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. Now notice here it says both Israel and Judah. Now Jeremiah wrote these words 100 years after the Assyrians had taken the northern kingdom into captivity. And yet he speaks of a future captivity of the descendants of the northern tribes at the same time as the Jews. And it says here there is a time of trouble greater than anything before. Now this terminology is used to talk about the Great Tribulation before the second coming of Jesus Christ. And this is confirmed when Jeremiah goes on to say that foreigners will no more enslave them, and they will then obey and serve God, and David who will be resurrected and rule over them. Now this passage and other verses show that the northern tribes were not fully mixed in with the Gentiles, but still have enough of a homogeneous core of people to be recognised even today. Now in Ezekiel 33 it speaks of the watchman being responsible to sound a warning before an invading army attacked the people. Now the church today has a collective responsibility to warn the nations of Israel and Judah about the coming captivity to come before the tribulation, so as many people, both spiritually and physically, can be saved. Now, if we are to understand which nations go into captivity along with the Jews during the Great Tribulation, then we need to know just where the descendants of the northern tribes migrated to. Now, notice what Jesus said to his disciples who had become the 12 apostles. Now, in Matthew 19:28 he says, "Assuredly I say to you that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones," as this, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now Jesus said that the 12 tribes of Israel will still exist when he returns, as the 12 apostles will be given rulership over them. And Josephus gives us a very clear idea of where the 10 tribes were in his day during the 1st century AD. Now, he wrote the following: "The 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude, and not to be estimated by numbers." End of quote. Now, beyond the Euphrates would have been a term for the great Parthian Empire, which twice defeated the Romans in battle. In fact, the Roman governors and kings like Herod and Pilate were under strict instructions not to antagonise the Parthians. The Roman historian Strabo says that the council of the Parthians included a group of men known as the Magi, who we actually read about in the story of Jesus Christ. Now, even the apostles in the New Testament were familiar with where the descendants of the northern tribes were in their day in the New Testament. Now, at the top of the list of visitors who witnessed the miracles on the day of Pentecost, we read about Parthians and Medes and Elamites and dwellers in Mesopotamia. Now, all these locations are on the opposite side of the Euphrates River, where Josephus placed the immense numbers of descendants of the northern tribes. Now, also amongst them would have been descendants of the Jews who never returned from Babylon, who would have been amongst these. Now, James also refers to the 12 tribes in the dispersion at the beginning of his epistle. So the dispersion referred to here is not just the Jews. And the Apostle Peter refers to some of these in the dispersion who are living in areas which are today a part of northern and central Turkey. Now, the patriarch Jacob, before he died, gave a series of prophecies about the descendants of each of his 12 sons and what shall befall them in the last days, which most likely does refer to the time leading up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, additionally, Moses also gave a series of prophecies about most of the tribes in Deuteronomy chapter 33. Now, on the handout on the tribes of Israel that I gave, I have quoted each of those prophecies and given notes on the identity of each of the tribes in our modern day based on those clues and the indirect historical evidence from the books which I'm about to refer to. We live in a very politically correct world, and because of that political correctness, a very obvious consideration is overlooked by many in relation to where to look for the descendants of the northern tribes. Now, have a think about some of the famous people that you know or who claim to have Jewish ancestry. Now, here's a number of faces of famous Jews. Now, what is their skin colour? Are they Asian, black, or Caucasian? Now, while there are some Jews who have darker skin due to intermarriage with other peoples, the vast majority of Jews today are Caucasian in appearance. They have white skin. Now, as the northern tribes also descend from Jacob, just like the Jews, doesn't it stand to reason and to good old common sense that the northern tribes are also a white-skinned Caucasian people? Now, if that's so, then the most likely place that their descendants migrated to are amongst the white-skinned Caucasian peoples who are mostly found in Europe. Now, the historical trail of evidence is more indirect after Josephus' comments about the location of the northern tribes. Now, that said, there is a significant amount of indirect evidence pointing towards the conclusion that they migrated in a northwest direction towards northwest Europe. Now, if Ephraim did migrate northwest to Europe, where do we find the fulfillment of the promise to Ephraim of becoming a group of nations amongst the nations of Europe and those other colonial nations descended from them? Well, if you restrict your search to just the white nations of Europe and their descendants elsewhere, there are two brother nations with a special relationship that stand out far beyond the rest: Britain and America. America truly is a great nation, and Britain became the greatest company of nations in world history. Now remember that God promised Ishmael would become a great nation, and the Arab Caliphate after the birth of Islam became an empire greater in size than the Roman Empire. So, how much greater would the birthright blessings of national greatness be? Now, the blessings of national wealth and prosperity that God promised to Jacob's, and specifically Joseph's descendants, like all of God's gifts, were to be used to help and uplift others, and in Israel's case, the nations around them. Now, in many great ways, they have been a blessing to other nations, while in other ways they have misused the blessings of great wealth and prosperity. Now, I can recommend some resources for those of you who wish to further investigate the historical evidence for their migrations. Now, on the left is our United Church of God booklet, the United States and Bible in Britain United States and Britain Bible Prophecy, which contains a good overview of the historical evidence, how the birthright promises were fulfilled, and the end time prophecies still to be fulfilled. Now, the book on the right is by a Jew named Yair Davidi. Now, as far as I'm aware, he's just a regular Jew, not a Messianic Jew, but he has written a major work coming to rather similar conclusions as to our booklet on the left. Now, on the back cover of his booklet, it says, "Proof is provided from the Bible, rabbinical sources, history, archaeology, mythology, and linguistics. The Tribes proves its case with irrefutable evidence, adequately referenced with academically accepted sources." End quote. And Stephen Collins has also written a very good 4-volume series on the history and migrations of Israel from the Old Testament times to the present. Now, the 4 books in his series include The Origin and Empire of Ancient Israel, Israel's Lost Empires, Parthia, and Israel's Triumphs Today. Now, the last book in this series highlights one very important connection between the fall of Parthia in 226 AD and the sudden emergence of the so-called barbarian tribes into Europe. Now, the Arabs who conquered Parthia were religiously intolerant, and huge numbers of former Parthians and Scythians migrated westward at that particular time. When Parthia fell in the 3rd century AD, you see the emergence of huge numbers of barbarian tribes enter Europe and trouble the Roman Empire. Now, one of the major routes was through the Caucasian mountains in Armenia, shown in white here on this map. Now, it was this mass migration of white peoples from the Middle East through that route where we get the term Caucasian from for white-skinned people. Now, a friend of mine in Sydney, Craig Wright, is the author of In Search of the Origin of Nations, which is the most extensive work that I've seen in trying to determine the nations who came from the biblical ancestors of Genesis 10. Now, he's got one particularly interesting paper on the origin of the Scots, in which he makes a good case that they also descend from the tribe of Judah, like the Jews in Israel. Now, remember that most Jews who went to Babylon didn't return to the land of Judah and followed many of the other Israelites into Europe. Now, it's interesting that Scots and Jews have some very interesting similarities, and I've covered those on the 12 tribes handout that I've given to you. Now, based on the research of those books that I've mentioned here is a map showing where their research points to as the most likely locations where the 12 tribes of Israel are to be found in our modern world. Now, those books all point to them migrating to northwest Europe, the modern state of Israel, Britain, the United States, Canada, the European descendant people in South Africa, as well as Australia and New Zealand. Now, there are 2 particularly interesting things to note here with the map and the flags of those nations believed to have descended from all the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, in Genesis 17:6, God promised to make Abraham a father of many nations and that kings would come from him. Now, from the late 1700s, starting in France, through to World War I, many European nations ditched their monarchies. Now, most of the remaining monarchies, these constitutional monarchies in Europe, just about all come from those nations in the northwest of Europe of Israelite descent. Now, the second thing to note is the dominance of 3 particular colours on the flags of the Israelite descendant nations: red, white and blue. Now, white symbolises righteousness, blue symbolises law, and red symbolises blood, such as the blood shed for sacrifice and the making of covenants. Now, the Israeli flag today is a combination of the blue stripes of a rabbi's prayer shawl and the Star of David. Now the Star of David may possibly be linked to the messianic prophecy of Numbers 24:17. It says, I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, a sceptre shall rise out of Israel. Now, given that most Jews reject Jesus as the true Messiah, I do find it ironic that the Israeli flag is only blue and white and is missing red. Now, during my first trip to Israel in 1999, I took this particular photo showing each of the emblems of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that's referred to in the handout that I gave you on the tribes of Israel. Now, in Revelation 7, we read about a group of 144,000 people who are sealed prior to the destruction of the day of the Lord. Now, the 144,000 is composed of 12,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Revelation 14:4 also notes that the 144,000 are the first fruits, or the church. So, are we talking about physical or spiritual Israelites here? Now, author Art Bradick, in his book The 144,000, notes that the order of the tribes of Israel in Revelation 7 is utterly unique. He writes, the fact that the tribes are not listed according to birth order, assembly by ensigns, or geographic location is another indicator that this is not physical Israel, end of quote. Now, what is unusual about this listing of tribes is that Dan is missing, and instead of Ephraim and Manasseh, the list strangely includes Joseph and Manasseh. So just why are Dan and Ephraim missing? Why are Dan and Ephraim missing? What is common to Dan and Ephraim amongst the tribes? Well, if you remember back to the split in Israel into two nations, when Jeroboam was set up as king over the northern tribes, he set up two golden calves at either end of the northern kingdom. One was at Dan in the north, and the other was at Bethel, which was in the tribal area of Ephraim. Now, the idolatry with these particular idols became known as the sins of Jeroboam, carried on by all the other kings of the northern tribes. Now, as well as the golden calves, Dan didn't drive out the Canaanites from their inheritance, and some of them weren't content with their inheritance and did their own thing by seeking a new area to settle all the way up in the north of Israel. And then we have the case of Samson, who consistently did his own thing and was also from the tribe of Dan. So perhaps the spiritual lesson that we can learn that's being emphasised here is that you can't go your own way like the tribe of Dan did and expect to be a part of the first fruits in the kingdom of God. Now, Art Bradick also notes, quote, the Almighty God inspired the names of the tribes of Israel in such a way that they tell a wonderful story of every true Christian struggle and ultimate triumph. Now, notice how a paragraph placing the meaning of the names in their order might read. I will praise the Lord, Judah. Behold, a son, Reuben, and then a troop, Gad, comes. Happy am I, Asher, because my wrestling Naphtali with God makes me forget Manasseh, my wife. God hears me, Simeon, and has joined me, Levi, to him. He has purchased me, Issachar, and my husband will dwell, Zebulun, with me. God will add me, Joseph, to the son of his right hand, Benjamin. End of quote. Now, sometime soon after he gave a series of end-time prophecies about the descendants of the 12 tribes, Jacob finally passes away. Now, he lived his final 17 years in Egypt with his son Joseph. And Jacob so he dies at 147, and Joseph is about 56 years old at this time. Now, Jacob's body was then taken up in a great procession up to Hebron and the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah were all buried. Now, Jacob also buried his wife Leah there, most likely before his move to Egypt. So that brings us to the end of the dramatic life of the great patriarch Jacob, who fathered the 12 sons from whom the 12 tribes of Israel descend from. Now let's remember and learn from the 5 lessons of Jacob that we've covered in this series. 1, don't take matters into your own hand and break God's law to have what you want or what God promises. 2, be an honest, hard worker as Jacob came to be. 3, tenaciously hold on to and depend on God like Jacob did. 4, purge out worldly influences the way Jacob had his clan put away their foreign idols. And 5, don't play favourites with your children. Like Jacob, let's all be overcomers with God and become true spiritual Israelites.